نرحب بكم في القمة العالمية للاقتصاد الأخضر.
Welcome to the World Green Economy Summit.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most graceful, the most merciful. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the 4th World Green Economy Summit, held under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President, Prime Minister of the UAE and the ruler of Dubai. We had an excellent day of discussions and debates yesterday, and today promises to be equally interesting. Make no mistake about that. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to invite Mr. Haji Naqdi, head of the Maguire Capital Asia and Middle East, to the stage for his keynote address. Please welcome him.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to speak at this highly prestigious and epical event here today, the 4th World Green Economy Summit. I'd like to thank our hosts and all the sponsors that have come to what we believe is a very critical and important event. The quality of the event over the last 24 hours and the program today, I think, are a testament to the vital importance of this sector tackling the enormous challenges that lie ahead. I think there can be no greater set of challenges for all of us than those posed by climate change. But equally, we must remember that for us as the financial institutions globally, there is also no greater set of opportunities. In my remarks today, I'd like to set out some thoughts on the green finance sector, share a bit of a perspective on the evolution of the sector and a sense of where the sector is heading. It is a bright future, and one in which Macquarie and the Green Investment Group sees itself as playing a pivotal part, and one in which the economy of Dubai and the efforts of DWA spearheading the green economy and the greening of Dubai also will see tremendous opportunities. With your permission, I'd like to take you back 5 years ago, where globally the renewable sector was still coming out of its infancy in terms of large-scale financing. And across Europe and Asia, a lot of financial institutions were starting to look at the opportunity. New funds were set up, and the UK Green Investment Bank was actually launching. The picture looked very different from today. Firstly, green infrastructure projects, believe it or not, 5 years ago, were struggling to attract investment. Investors were still feeling the shockwaves of the global financial crisis. The debt markets were constrained by changes to regulatory regimes, and equity had retreated to so-called safer options. The utilities in Europe that had traditionally led investment found themselves hamstrung by the fundamental changes facing the European power sector, and similar challenges were felt around the world. A lot has changed in the last 5 years. Let me give you a few examples to paint a picture. Firstly, some green technologies, including some such as offshore wind and waste-to-energy, have matured to such a degree that the liquidity gap has been filled. The project backlog has been cleared, and capital is competing over a small number of project opportunities. In the last 10 years, total world renewable energy capacity has increased from 989,000 megawatts in 2007 to over 2,000 megawatts last year. And the amount of green bonds issued last year was $81 billion, a massive multiple of the $3 billion that was issued in 2012. Secondly, over the last 5 years, costs have fallen significantly. There is no more area evident than in the offshore wind industry globally, where the cost of production has fallen so dramatically that the industry constantly finds itself ahead of the benchmarks predicted by the pundits and the analysts in the industry. Prices have come down to a point where it is, on a levelized cost of energy basis, lower in some markets than conventional power. Thirdly, the cost of capital has fallen as project delivery risks have decreased. Banks have taken comfort to lend more and earlier into projects. And the technical expertise that is required to get the financing market comfortable is ever more prevalent and ever more demonstrated, as it is here in Dubai, with a strong pipeline of projects that are being delivered and continue to be delivered. Fourth, and in many ways most importantly, the investment community has become much better educated in green infrastructure. This has enabled us to assess and price risks a lot more sharply, and numerous global green funds have been set up. Pension funds, industrial and financial investors are participating, and there has been tens of billions of dollars of capital invested in the sector. Between Macquarie and the Green Investment Bank alone, it's upwards of $20 billion in the last 5 years, but that's one small example of what's happening around the world, and a great example of that here is in Dubai, where the amount of capital being attracted already into the sector here is greater than what was predicted. And the market here is ahead. So the picture today looks more positive than it did 5 years ago, but there is still so much more to do. There are many areas where the market still needs specialists, strategically committed investors prepared to push out the frontier of what is considered commercially investable. Let's look at some of the trends and where the opportunities might lie. Firstly, the efforts to decarbonize economies around the world are intensifying. As a result, governments around the world are opening up new policy fronts. We're seeing trends in power generations and the energy transition accelerating. And whatever targets and predictions are being made today are being outstripped almost immediately as new targets are being set. The second thing is that governments have begun moving from mature technologies through to new processes to support even more risk being taken by the market. We are looking at a world in 5 to 10 years where a lot of the renewable energy sector will operate without subsidy. That is the reality. It's not a great news for everybody in the investment business, but it will be a great news for government. Third, falling costs continue and are going to play a critical role in some of the technologies that will allow renewable energy to play even a bigger role in the energy supply equation. One of those areas is in the space of batteries, where clearly battery technologies together with renewables are going to be very important in tackling the issue of intermittency. But we are also seeing technological advances taking us towards a more decentralized, distributed model. And the convergence of infrastructure and technology in new areas such as the Internet of Things, such as decentralized energy trading, these trends are going to have even further impacts. And we'll see the world shifting from a central generation model to one where you have distributed generation, and that will have implications. In that world, we see the role of the utilities actually increasing, not decreasing, but their role will be different in the future. All these three trends, the continuing shift to decarbonization, the change in technology emphasis and the removal of subsidies over time, and the falling cost of technology will lead to an increased demand for new investment, but different responses will be needed from us in the investment community. What is clear that a business as usual approach to green infrastructure investment won't be enough. The challenges we're going to face in the next 10 years are going to require understanding a different set of risks and a different means and approach towards building investor confidence. Partnering, and in particular partnering between the private sector and the government, will be a key part of the way forward. We see already a significant track record being built in investment on the forefront of market development. And we see here in Dubai a wonderful example of that in the program that has been spearheaded by DWA. We think that whatever the challenges and trends that are coming in the next 10 years, working together will be as important in the next 10 as it has been in the last 10 in terms of bringing the green economy forward. Our commitment to our founding mission at the Green Investment Group and at Macquarie remains undiminished. We're here to support the development of the growing green infrastructure market and hastening the transition to a global green economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Naqvi. Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me the great pleasure to introduce the first session of the day, entitled Green Finance, the Role of the Financial Sector in the Green Economic Transformation. And with that title revealed, please join me in welcoming the moderator of the session, Mr. Anthony Curry, Associate Editor for Breaking Views, along with the speakers. And they are Mr. James Grabbert, Director for Sustainable Development Mechanisms at the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, Mr. Robert Todd, the Global Head of Renewables and Clean Tech for HSBC, Mr. Frank Beckers, Head of Project Finance and Advisory for First Abu Dhabi Bank, and finally, Professor Valerio De Luca, Executive Chairman of the International Academy for Economic and Social Development. These are the names for your first session, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and Your Excellencies, thanks for inviting me to come here, and our panelists as well. Welcome to the second day, and keynote speaker, thanks for a great way to kick off the day. Now, let me just explain who I am and why I'm here. I'm actually a financial journalist. I cover banks, I cover car companies, based out of New York. Now, Breaking Views is the financial commentary arm of Reuters. So what we do is we take opinion. We can be pretty brash about deals that are being done and what banks and investors are doing. And most of our readers are bankers and hedge funds, and to some extent corporates. So what am I doing at a green finance conference since I cover Wall Street and car companies? Well, both of those are getting involved more and more, as you all know. But what struck us, when it first struck us that this was a big topic for us to cover, was about 4 years ago. It was early July. We'd seen a report about the economic benefits and problems of water. So I wrote a piece about it. We put it out right before the July the 4th holiday in New York, in a month full of corporate earnings, which all of our readers love to lap up. And at the end of the month, we realized it was one of the top 10 read articles of the month, out of about 500 or 600 articles. And that set off a light bulb for us. Here is a market that clearly our readers are very interested in taking part in and reading about. And I think what we've heard at the conference so far confirms that. And there is a great deal of money waiting on the sidelines. As Zoe Knight from HSBC said yesterday, 2/3 of investors surveyed by her bank said, yeah, we'd love to put more money into this. And there's, as she said, $100 trillion or more needed just for infrastructure over the next 10 years or so. So the opportunities are huge. And so it's no surprise to me, really, that when I look at the banks I cover, I see a lot of them, especially those with big wealth management arms, deciding to set up research arms, deciding to get into more sustainable development ideas, whether it's through innovation or, more importantly, I think for them, they're setting up institutes to do research and also more funding as well. But those, I think, to some extent, are banks worried about losing the money from the people in, people in their 60s, 70s who are going to leave their money to their millennial children. I think a lot of these banks are worried about losing that money, that millennials want their money to be invested in a socially responsible way. But I think a lot of our banks are seeing that there's a big opportunity here as well, as our keynote speaker was saying. And yet, despite all this, there is this really big impression, despite what the keynote speaker said, there's a big impression that banks and financial services in general, institutional finance, isn't doing enough in the world of green investing in the green economy. So that's where we're going to start off today. I'm going to pitch this one to Frank. We did kind of discuss this earlier, but Frank, when we first discussed this a couple of weeks ago, you were saying, hang on, that's not quite right. So why don't I put it to you, why is it you think that there's this sense that banks aren't doing enough? Is it a holdover from the crisis where banks are still regarded as somewhat evil? Is it because everyone's looking at startups and thinking that banks aren't doing enough? What's your impression from where you sit here?
Well, I think predominantly we as the financial service industry are to some extent, of course, following our clients and following the needs of our clients. And that's why there may be sometimes a little gap in us serving the needs. But we've been playing a very important role in green financing or environmental financing for a long time. If you just look at how and where some of these standards evolved from decades ago, defined by World Bank and others. So I think there's a consciousness in the financial industry for a long time with respect to environmental safety, etc. I mean, here in the region, of course, the region has now taken a leading role in developing renewable energy, for example, with large-scale projects, with targets much higher than we have seen them in other countries. And we have been, as banks, local banks as much as international banks, but also particularly local banks, supporting those initiatives by financing all these large-scale projects. That's how the region here was actually started. But as I said, we are a bit following the demand, and we may have not yet been so good on serving demand for much smaller investments, but those are just starting. So as the demand will evolve there, we will follow and we will come up with products. On the big projects, you mentioned, do we have enough capital there? I think the banks are very much active in this, and we will continue financing this. We like renewable energy, but if you look at the targets being set for the region, they're so high, which is very good, but they're so high, they're requesting so much capital that I think in the long term we will need additional liquidity sources to come to the table, because we won't be able to do it as banks alone. And the biggest, obviously, liquidity source that's there is the capital markets, which we will need in the future. If we look at the 2050 targets for Dubai, for example, that's just too much for the banking industry to do. Yeah. So we need more then.
I mean, we'll get back to the capacity issue in a minute, but Robert, let's turn to you. I mean, your role, I mean, your title basically screams to clients of all sizes, come to me. And you must be getting pitches from people that just don't fit into your remit, but they may be very small. I mean, I'm assuming that much like Frank, you're dealing with big projects. And yet, you put clean tech in the title, and that to me seems you're going to be getting, startups galore coming to you saying, hey, here we are, come give us some money.
No, that's right. We have a wide range of customers, from the very small to the very large, on a worldwide basis. And for us, it's important to see how we can be relevant to each of those in their different situations. It may be funding large-scale projects on the one hand, but it could be more of a growth emphasis for some of our smaller clients, whether that's a project development type business or whether that's a technology startup type business. Each one has obviously a different profile and different prospects, and we have to look to try and support them where we can.
And what about capital rules that have come in since the crisis? Has that constrained your ability to do certain business? Start with you, Robert.
I wouldn't say so. I think an institution like HSBC is very relationship focused. So where we have relationships, and in an area like this where the world is creating a new category, essentially, we're forming new relationships all of the time. And for us, that means a long-term partnership, effectively, where we can help people in many different respects. So I wouldn't say those particularly have created any barriers for us. There are multiple different sort of tools and products and services that we can be helpful in.
What about you, Frank? What's your view on capital rules? Capital rules and how they've affected your ability to lend to clients?
Well, I'm not so sure it's capital rules. To some extent it is, but there's also other effects. I mean, if we look effectively, the way these projects are currently financed here in the region is I don't want to become too technical, but is on a soft mini-perm basis, which basically means it's not truly long-term financing that's being provided, but there is a very strong incentive imposed on the borrower, on the project, to refinance about 5 to 7 years down the road. And that is to some extent driven by capital rules, particularly for international banks, but increasingly also for us. But that's also simply driven by very large liquidity costs that we have and refinancing costs, and that make very long-term lending simply very expensive. And our clients are always in a very competitive scenario where they have to bid very low electricity prices, and the best outcome for both sides is to have long legal tenors, but effectively a shorter-term financing where we get into refinancing. But again, if we want to overcome this, if we want to go into truly long-term financing, the instrument that's really suited to do this is capital markets instruments. So it would be very interesting to see how much refinancings we'll see by way of bonds, whether they're called green or not, sometime down the road when these mini-perms start kicking in and become very expensive.
Yeah. And James, let's bring in you here. Frank is saying that we need capital markets to get involved. From your position, how do you see that developing? Obviously, the keynote speaker mentioned green bonds, which is a topic we can get onto as well. There's a lot of concern about standards, about the right metrics, about whether there's the best way to, what's the best way to get more investors involved. And what have you seen so far, especially as the green bond market itself has grown, as our keynote speaker was saying?
Well, yeah. Well, as we heard, 81 billion in green bonds last year. But let's remind ourselves there's 10 billion or more dollars a day in bonds being issued, if I'm not mistaken. So we're talking about 1%. So it definitely needs to be bigger if we're talking about the scale of the problem. To deal with what the Paris Agreement has asked us to do, for countries to deliver on what they're to do, for society to be involved in the private sector as well, we need basically massive scale up in terms of the financing. And I know that's why we're having these discussions, but I just want to put that context there. But in terms of what the solutions are, there are three things I would say. First of all, there's definitely a role in the sustainable finance space at the national level. They need clear roadmaps. If government's goals are not being set in a way that are leading towards clean investment, and it may be regulations on capital flows or other things, but there's definitely that needs to change. So it's not just the banks, the investors; it's also the national governments have to align through the process that's established and through the Paris Agreement and their national determined contributions. But to get to the nitty-gritty, it's about not only having putting projects out there, but putting in place the policy frameworks, the policy decisions, to not be involved in things where your infrastructure are in hindering capital flow. Have fiscal policy aligned towards green investment. Many of those things. The second thing is it's about the targeted. It has to be an awareness, I would say, from the organizations about the importance of really disclosing their risk.
Right.
Organizations, the whole effort that's moving forward globally about the risk disclosure has to be done. It has to be implemented. It has to be more than just voluntary. Without the clarity of what you're exposed to, it's not just the physical, and it is. We see climate change as a long-term issue. No, it's also a very short-term issue. It's not just the long-term climate impacts. It's the immediate impacts on your corporate profiles due to the changing technologies, changing climate policy, changing market behavior. There's a huge risk. And that would help better understand the need for investment, the types of investment, et cetera. And then finally, what you were asking about is the whole measurement element. The impact of investments have to be clearly measured. We need to all have better data, I think, on again how the investments can drive our capital asset changes. Right now, we have estimates, from say 5 trillion to 43 trillion could be the impact on existing assets by 2050 because of the risk. Is that the best we can say? That comes from the economists. We need more information. We need to be able to measure things more accurately. You will get response from the investors, I think, with everyone involved, the national, the private sector, the organizations, understanding the real risk they're involved with and understanding the need for that investment and to communicate it. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Valeria, let's bring you in. You were talking earlier on to me about metrics as well. I mean, what's your take on what else can be done to involve the financial community, as it were, in investing more in this area?
Tony, before let me thank His Excellency Said Mohammed Al Tayer, Walid Salman, the organization and the sponsor to have kindly invited me to this important event that call each of us to work together and to share experience and visions. And we live, I think, with two sentiments. We live in turmoil and transition, fear and hope. And one of the problems is that the market and the financial institutions are sometimes confused of what is called green economy. I think that is a problem of definition, awareness and culture. There is a way of saying in Italy, but also I think in the UK, they say that where there is a will, there is a way. There are a general consensus of the urgent necessity to greening our societies and economies, to the transition of, to change the economy, but not only changing the economy, but to better people's life. But we are still in thinking solution, and this general consensus will crash on data and numbers. Only 1% of the total investment and issuance of green bond are on the market. Investors still suffer of risk, reputational risk, low liquidity, and environmental risk. And so this is a problem of interpretation. So what we can do? First of all, I think that we have to scale up the pathway. We need the cooperation of private and public sector to align the financial market development with the policy action through a flexible implementation of standards, principles, and the criteria of metrics. But also we need a friendly regulation and to translate this vision standard in international harmonization and institutional reform, fiscal policy. So the challenge is very high to foster the prosperity. And one of, maybe we can talk later about this, one of the tools could be the fintech associated to the green economy.
Okay, thanks, Valeria. So, I mean, let's dig into a couple of these things. I mean, on green bonds, for example, and Robert, let me put this to you. I think 80 to 100 billion of issuance probably this year. We've got companies out there like Apple issuing green bonds, and I'm not going to say that they're right or wrong to do it, but Apple doesn't really need to issue a green bond. So, is the green bond market really out there properly yet to be used for proper green issues for those who need to tap that market? I mean, do you get better financing from it? Is it really opening up the market to more investors? Or is it, I mean, I don't want to be rude and call it green mail, but is it a bit of a marketing ploy for some of the big cash-rich companies to be using it, for example? I don't expect you to badmouth Apple, by the way, don't worry. I can do that.
Which question do I answer first? So I think with the green bond market, there was a certain element, I think, at the outset of corporate sustainability type philosophy, but I think that's fundamentally changed. And I think this year particularly we've seen an acceleration. I think it was mentioned in the keynote speech around a number of features, the acceleration in the growth of green bond issuance, the accelerated decline in LCOE, the accelerated decline in capital cost, the sheer number of new faces emerging in the industry. And I think as a consequence, we've seen a real willingness for issuers to bring green bonds to the market. And we've seen an appetite from fixed income investors to subscribe to those bonds. And those issues tend to be oversubscribed quite heavily. Ourselves, our platform has been one of the big drivers in green bond issuance across sovereigns, across all different segments, including renewable energy. And I think part of that also is the fact that there is a topic now which is elevated and mainstream, so there's greater familiarity, but also to some degree more maturity in some of the projects, particularly from, say, a renewable energy perspective, where over time now, rather than small, highly subsidized projects, we're looking at gigawatts of capacity on more economic terms. And that then provides the foundation for perhaps a more diverse range of financing sources, which can include green bonds. So that's one strand of potential financing, but that has opened up dramatically, and I can only see that increasing over time.
And Frank, you mentioned a couple of times the need for capital markets to take on more. Does the growth of the green bond market give you hope that that's already happening, or do you see these as mostly investors who would have bought paper by some of these companies anyway?
Well, I would hope it will support capital markets to come to the table, but ultimately it's just a function of for most people it's just a function of risk and return. So I think that's how the capital markets are driven. For me, always the question is, when we look at green bonds, what is the motivation to do green bonds? Well, and I see two. It's on the one hand people that do it for reputational reasons. I don't think, for example, here in the region, the renewable projects will have to do it for reputational reasons, because they're green by definition, but it's a renewable project, so they don't suffer from this. And the other one is people who otherwise don't have access to financing and see a route to get access to bond financing through green. And it's also a problem which the projects will not have, but it may be able to attract more investors by having that green logo, because it's not just purely commercial investors that otherwise would do a project bond, but also some others that actually want to invest in green. Right. So I definitely hope it's going to help, and I would think that we'll see this region will most likely be the one that will see green type of project bonds earlier than or to a larger extent, simply because this region started off with a very large scale projects which are suited for capital markets instruments, while other regions like in Europe, they started off with the smaller investments, and you first have to get to sizes that actually make sense. If you look at projects, on the corporate side, that's usually always there, the size, but at projects you first have to get to volumes that justify a capital market instrument. Here we don't have the problem. All these projects are several hundreds of millions of dollars large, so they're really, really very well suited to attract a bond structure.
Do you see a green bonds helping companies to disclose more, as James was saying? I mean, Robert, let's put that to you first. Do you see, is disclosure improving at a certain level, at least, because of green bonds?
Absolutely, yes. I think there's greater disclosure, and there's increasing scrutiny generally around intensity at all levels. So throughout the life, I think there'll be more emphasis on corporates and groups to actually disclose their consumption, the patterns, the origin, whether that's energy, whether that's raw materials, and so forth. There is simply more scrutiny out there, and the market is demanding more disclosure. And I suppose green bonds is a good example of that.
And James, I mean, you brought that topic up. Have you seen that in green bonds as well? I mean, you did mention it briefly, but what other things are needed, do you think, for green bonds to attract more investors and corporates?
Well, I mean, we have the outputs of the task force on the climate-related disclosure that ideally should not be voluntary, but move to be a standard that needs to be followed. So national governments need to take this serious and look at this and see how in their own environments can make this happen and implement it, first of all. Second of all, I think all the corporations need to really think about not just the disclosure is part of it, but to get to there, you also have to understand what is the real pathway of your manageable assets out through 2050. What is the real the climate risk there, and to understand that, and to hopefully do that and look at that in a consistent way. There are efforts underway internationally, and there's initiatives on the transition pathways for this, for example, to help corporations consistently look at how they would look at this pathway of their assets through 2050. There's work we're doing with the ISO to develop standards that can be consistently used to measure the real impact of the investment side. So all of these efforts, I think, could also do more than, could do addition to what the actual products are also driving the change, of course, but the international community and the national governments have to be involved in really, creating the standards and enforcing them and insisting that, we all globally start using a common set of metrics and tools.
Yeah. When I look at the investor side, I do see a lot of pressure coming from investors for more information. And one company that I deal with a fair bit is CDP, which does a lot of work on getting companies to disclose more information. Robert, the companies you deal with, how willing are they to go down that path of giving more disclosure? And how far along the process would you say a lot of them are? I mean, have they got down into disclosing more about their supply chains that may help investors appreciate the risk more? I mean, I hear good things being done, but I'm just not sure how deep it goes into the corporate world.
I think we're very early in the journey, to be honest. I think there are corporates taking a lead. There are all sorts of other related initiatives like RE100 and so forth, where corporates are looking at themselves, looking at their profile, and making public announcements as a result. So they're willing to put themselves in the public eye and make commitments. Others are maybe more in sort of review mode to try to understand their own position. It's not always easy to perhaps audit yourself in many ways. And there are also groups who are looking more deeply and examining the supply chain and thinking about all those relationships. And if you imagine when you take that into consideration, it's a proliferation of relationships at that point.
Yeah.
So it becomes a much more complex exercise. So I think there's a whole spectrum of different groups. You've mentioned some of the high-profile type names, but the theme is definitely permeating more deeply now.
Yeah. And Frank, let's get on to the theme of what governments can do. I mean, we were talking earlier on, before the session, you brought up Germany earlier on the panel. Germany started off with very small investments for rooftop solar or whatever. And you were saying beforehand that in the region here, for example, which I think you mentioned, big projects of where it started. Can what the KfW Bank in Germany and what the UK government did in Britain to try and push solar, for example, at an individual level, can that be used here as well? Do you think there are lessons to be learned from those markets to be used in this region to increase smaller lending, which then might expand and you guys could get involved, well, your bank at least, if not your department, could get involved in more readily?
Well, definitely you can basically also use some of the instruments that have been used in Europe. You could use them here. It's all a question of what your targets are, what the political will is. I mean, in Germany, of course, they wanted to promote rooftop solar and also wanted to give people, individuals, household owners, cheap access to financing. So basically they created government subsidized loans through KfW, which have a certain interest subsidy, and obviously your investment needs to qualify for it. So there's pretty severe criteria which you have to fulfill. When you fulfill them and your investment qualifies, it can be a solar on the roof, it can be a house with that you build with a certain efficiency, energy efficiency, then you will have access to this financing. And that makes it's not that these people would otherwise not have access to financing, but they get access to cheaper financing this way, right? So this is a way to promoting it through a cheaper access to financing. And I think we see some initiatives starting here to give people access to some funds, green energy funds, government funds, for rooftop and other green investments. So definitely, yes, it's something that the region can use. I think it's much more suited, as you said, it's suited for the household owner, for smaller type of investments that otherwise struggle to get access to finance.
And Valerio, let's bring you back in here. You'd mentioned fintech earlier on. How do you see that working as filling these gaps that may be there for the smaller companies or even for individuals? Obviously, we've seen fintech lending work pretty well, within reason, pretty well in certain areas like the US for consumers who have lower credit rating. How do you see it working in this environment, though, in trying to increase access to capital for green projects?
First of all, fintech is not only a unique, one sole only technology. It's a complex, it's a system of systems of technologies. Is combine Internet of Things, blockchain, artificial intelligence, peer-to-peer platform. So it's something that is really complex. Also, we have not to forget that the technology is an instrument that is neutral respecting to the hands. Business and political leaders has to set up these hands. And if one of the goals of the leaders is the financial inclusions, I think that fintech could help the challenge, the change that come up from the bottom. I mean that some companies, unbanked, start-up, small and medium enterprises, through the peer-to-peer platform and this kind of decentralized and disintermediated platform can access easily to the capital market. But also we have to think that there are not only opportunities but also some risk with the fintech. Just think about the technological unemployment, the role of automated robots in the financial market. So there are also a lot of risk. We have to maximize the opportunities and to minimize, of course, the risk. But I think that the fintech coming from the bottom up could really make change, and in particular to connect the financial system with the real economy. The financial crisis that we experienced had this problem to disconnect the financial system to the people, to the real economy. It came up with an autonomous system that created a lot of inequalities. And I think that fintech could help to promote and foster prosperity from the bottom. And Italy, for example, is doing well on this issue. And as well as Dubai, the government has involved the green finance in its strategic and governmental strategies. The government agreed to a lot of standards and principles agreed internationally. The private sector, in particular the Italian exchange market, has approved and introduced a new segment just for green finance with a list of requirements and disclosures and a lot of also transparency requirements. So I think that starting from the top of the governments and with the small and medium enterprises, we have 4 million of small and medium enterprises in Italy that have to access to the financial market and green economy. So I think that fintech could be a good opportunity.
Thanks, Valerio. So let me put this to you, Robert. When it comes to fintech, especially I think mostly about lenders, and I look in the US and I see banks striking up a lot of different relationships with these disintermediators, whether it's to buy their loans, whether it's to repackage them into bonds, or even to refer clients to them if they just don't fit into the bank's lending routine. Is that something you could see develop here in green finance, that fintech, you could actually not just be disintermediated by them, but actually use them as a way to either win you business or give business that you wouldn't otherwise take?
Yes, I would say so. I think it sort of comes back to the introduction of new technologies and the innovation element, which is having more impact today on many different business models, whether that's our role as a financial institution, whether that's an energy business, and what are the sort of conventional structures that perhaps they're adopting today. But what we're seeing is the introduction of many new structures, peer-to-peer type arrangements in a distributed setting. They are now becoming more common. We are seeing those in many different settings, and I think as we move into this more decentralized type energy system, those types of elements will help when we're thinking about real-time management of demand and supply, rather than the typical centralized model. So I think there will be more emphasis, and as people become more comfortable that there's integrity in those types of models, that the technology works, that there's a track record, that you have the assurance that your counterparty is the counterparty that you think they are, etc., then there'll be a broader adoption of those types of systems.
Thanks, Robert, and thank you, gentlemen. We're unfortunately running out of time. If you do have questions, please do come up and ask them at the panelists at the end. But for now, please join me in thanking James, Robert, Frank, and Valerio for taking part this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a very interesting session. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. David D. Rothschild, internationally renowned explorer, a Clean Up the World ambassador, and a United National Environmental Programme's climate hero, to deliver his green talk. Please welcome him.
Good morning. How is everybody? Everyone had their coffee? Feeling energized for today? Well, firstly, it's always a great honor to get to share my stories. I always feel very humbled to be able to share stories. So thank you, firstly, for allowing me this opportunity to chat to you, and hopefully you will find something of interest. People often ask me, what is your story? Where do you come from? And I always say that, this is a great quote by Einstein: I have no special talents, I'm only passionately curious. And I think curiosity is one of the greatest, I should say, human conditions that we can have. I, as a child, was very curious. This is me. My hairstyle hasn't got much better. It's actually way cooler then, I think, when I was a child. I was the kind of child who, let's just say, was a little bit troubling to the class, troubling to other children. When I was a child, my mother would drop me off at school, and then I would sit in the school, and I would sit there waiting. I'd wait until everyone left, and I would start causing trouble. And then I would look out, and I'd see all the parents would be looking in, and they would move their children from where I was sitting away from me, because they wanted their children to learn and not get in trouble. I basically didn't really want to be inside the classroom. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because often people say to me, how do you become an explorer? You don't become an explorer, you're born an explorer. We're all explorers. But the moment that somebody tells you that you can't do something, or don't do this, or teaches you that you can't do something, that exploration, that curiosity is taught out of us. And as we get older, what happens is that we start to be more afraid, maybe to ask questions. We start to let the ego get in front of us. We start to think that maybe if we ask a question, and it's a silly question, even though it may help us get somewhere, we'd rather not be seen to be wrong or not know it, so we won't ask. And so for me, being curious has always been my driving force. And to that end, I have seen myself travel across Antarctica. I kited all the way across Antarctica back in 2004. I have seen myself crossing over the North Pole. I tried to cross from Russia all the way across to Canada, through the North Pole, 110 days on the ice. By the way, when I'm telling you all of this, I still can't do a push-up, more than 10 push-ups. I still like a warm bath and eat good food, and I'm not one of those adventurers who's hanging from a mountain telling everybody he's bigger and better. So please, don't take this as that. I have had the fortune to travel the world, though. I've been a National Geographic explorer for 10 years. I have really made it my life to be curious, to be outside of the classroom, as I said, into nature's classroom. Nature is, for me, the greatest mentor, the greatest teacher. It is one of the greatest gifts that we have, is Spaceship Earth. And so as I've traveled around the world, I have found myself becoming more, I guess, humble about the challenges that we face as individuals on this planet. And what I do realize, though, is that we all have a capacity to share the same values and the same ideals, and we all want the same things. We ultimately want the same things: love, security, education, health. We want to be validated. We want to be heard. We want the same things. So for me, this has always been my curiosity. And then back in 2010, I started reading about this plastic in the ocean. Has anybody ever heard of the Eastern Garbage Patch? Nobody. So this is great. I can make it all up now. So the Eastern Garbage Patch, in fact, is now no longer just a patch. It is the entire ocean. It's filling with plastic. We have seen our oceans now starting to show the signs of what I call human fingerprints everywhere. Wherever there is a current in our ocean, we're starting to see convergence. So I decided that I would try and raise some awareness of this. So I decided to build a boat entirely out of plastic bottles. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that this is, for me, it really was a symbol of anything is possible, taking the impossible and making it possible. And I think today when we stand here and listen to talks, or you walk through to the halls and you see what's going on around you, you can see the impossible conversations becoming the possible through technology, through investment, through innovation, through curiosity and optimism. This project was fundamentally started with the concept of, could we build a boat entirely of plastic bottles to sail across the Pacific? That was the idea, to sail from San Francisco all the way to Sydney. It started out, as I said, as a very crazy idea. It took me 4 years to develop it. It was, again, a symbol of teamwork, the idea that anything was possible. We took the bottle out of the waste and we put it into the side of the boat. We created a superstructure frame around it, innovating new materials to do that. It was 60 foot long. We spent 4 months at sea on this vessel, crossing, as I said, the Pacific, which is the largest ocean. 23% of our planet is made up of the Pacific. Spending all our days tweeting, and this was actually before Instagram. Amazing how quickly these things come on. But we were tweeting. Everyone's like, wow, tweeting, who does that nowadays? But we were. We were tweeting and sharing our stories and trying to create this sort of momentum behind this story. When we finished this project, the world had sort of sat up and started to listen about plastic in the ocean. We had all these great comments. People were very excited. You know, congratulations, the media. This was me in the sort of pink hat here, coming out, surrounded by the world's media, asking us all these questions. After 4 months at sea, you can imagine it was quite intimidating. We even got voted, you know, Innovation of the Year by Time magazine. We were one of the best innovations of the year. Something that started out as a very silly, crazy idea became an Innovation of the Year. And everyone would then say, wow, that's congratulations, what a great success. You know, this was fantastic. You must be very proud. And I guess I was very proud. And I was very excited to be part of that project. But deep down inside, I realized that we hadn't solved anything. The problem of plastic still existed. The problem of disposability still existed. In fact, more plastic had entered into the ocean during our voyage than we could have saved in that period of time. I mean, it was just rampant, the amount of plastic. And I started to think about how do we, as individuals, look at ROI, return on investment. I say return on impact. For me, it was around a culture shift. The Plastiki started a culture shift. But more than that, it made me start to think about this great big planet of ours, Spaceship Earth. You know, this is a shot from underneath Saturn's rings. Recently, the Cassini project, which was a satellite that was going around Saturn, documenting it, took this photo. This is 1.2 billion kilometers away from Earth. That's us, this little thing. This is a chance for me to use my laser. Doesn't reach. Even my laser doesn't reach the Earth. That's how far away it is. And when you look at that, you think to yourself, this is it. There's nothing else around us. I did notice yesterday that in, I think it was 2117, you guys are going to be going to Mars. I saw that in the presentation, so I thought that was very exciting. I would say go to the moon first, just a side note. It's 4 days away. No one's doing it. Everyone should stop there. It's the first stop in space. Mars is 9 months away, and still no guarantee that we can actually inhabit it. So Elon's amazing, and we root for him, but I would say go to the moon. It's close, much easier. This, though, is planet Earth. This is our spaceship. As Buckminster Fuller said. He said in 1963, it has to be everybody or nobody. He coined that phrase. This was 5 years before this was even taken. This photograph was, or the first photograph of the planet in 1968, which was called Earthrise. So when I look at this, I keep on thinking to myself, we have to do everything possible. We have to stop the destruction of our planet. Does anybody know the game Jenga? Yeah? There's a few people in here. Jenga is one of these games that when you pull a block out, it gets wobblier and wobblier, and then at some point it collapses. I feel like we're playing a game of death Jenga with Spaceship Earth. We're starting to pull different bricks from this system. There used to be an intentionality to our destruction. Now we're just pulling things out. This year alone, we will lose hundreds of species. Some of them we haven't named, we haven't understood. Some of them, could hold the secret to the success of our ability to live on this planet. Yet we keep on pulling these blocks out, and they keep on becoming wobblier and wobblier. We're starting to see destruction of our rainforests like never before. This shot was in Borneo. Palm oil survivors, 3 generations of elephants. We're starting to see things happening that we have no control of. This was shot in Indonesia. This is a surfer on a wave, covered by plastic. The idyllic shots that we thought of these waves are now changing forever. We're starting to continue to slaughter animals at a rate for nothing more than ego, because it is a sign of status, or it's a sign that we can control it. On our watch, which is now, we will lose the African elephant, we will lose the rhinos, we will lose the cheetahs, we will lose all of the big mammals, the mountain gorillas, on our watch. 10, 15 years, none of these will exist in the wild at the rate we are going. In the last decade, 110,000 African elephants have been slaughtered on our watch. For what? That's what's so frustrating. And as we see in intentionality, the pollution gets bad, it gets worse and worse and worse. We're starting to see the effects, the negative effects of our human fingerprints all across our planet. There's a thing called banking on extinction. Has anybody heard of this phrase, banking on extinction? As we know, when things become scarce, they become more valuable. So we are now hoarding bluefin tuna in the markets of Skiji. We're actually holding them back, deep freezing them, knowing that that stock will disappear, so that the premium and the price goes up. So we're banking on the fact that this, by the way, the tuna is the cheetah of the ocean. It travels at 60 miles an hour through the ocean. It's a carnivore. It is the fastest predator almost in the ocean. Yet we are lining it up to disappear. So, as an environmentalist, I get to stand here and basically beat the drum of all the bad news. I am like the undertaker of the wilderness. And it kind of sucks, if I'm honest. Because for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been having to tell the same problems. And I feel like all I do is tell people about the bad news. So it started to play on my mind. Started to think about how can we change that? We're facing what I would call a nature emergency, but yet we're not connecting. We're not finding it in ourselves sometimes to actually move the needle forward to find the solutions. And if you take the word emergency, a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. But why aren't we reacting? What stops us from reacting? I think the first thing that stops us from reacting is that we think that nature is outside of us. We've created this false dichotomy that nature's on one side and we're on the other. Not to mention that as we become more hyper-connected, we become more hyper-disconnected to nature. Right? We all do it. I do it. We all, we sit there, we look at our phones, we look at nature on TV, and then we switch off. And we look at it as something outside. We don't see ourselves as part of the system. The models that we've made for our economy, they are also disconnecting. I say to people often, when you think about GDP, gross domestic product, I say it's a grossly deceptive position. If you can't have nature factored into our GDP, the true cost then is not really there. It's a fake value. Why do we only revere companies that make more rather than improve? Right? Why can't we find it in ourselves to say, if you're doing something for the planet and for people and improving, then you have a great opportunity to become a greater company. The way we manufacture has now become almost like an army, you know? So we're disconnected from where our products come from, where they start. We start to create environments like this. This is the 99-cent store. You walk in there and you're like, whoa, what happened? Where did all this stuff come from? Right? We've also started to, in some ways, use the green thing as a thing. I often see brands coming out, you know, every drop is green. This is Fiji water. I like this on the side here. I think they kind of copied my boat idea in their marketing. You know, but we have things like the big, you know, eco razor. Because it's made of green plastic, it's apparently green. It's not, but just using a metal one that you can reuse instead of throwing away. We don't need to throw these things away. So we've got to stop rewarding green if it's not truly green. I think we got distracted by the greatest distraction of all. I think the climate summit was fantastic and inspiring, and it got us together. But it's after 25 years, is the best thing we can do as a group of people is just go, I think we've got a problem. We've got to do more than that, right? I always think if we actually take the word climate change and replace it with the word pollution, it would be far more engaging, right? No one wants pollution. This was actually taken in China. People often laugh at this and go, wow, that can't be possible. So they put a screen up so you could have a photograph in situ because the pollution's there. That can't be possible, but it's true. People say, wow, how can they do that? And I say, well, are you any better? Who's on Facebook? Anybody on Facebook here? A few of you. We all do it. You know, that last image is no different to being on Facebook, and then you see something horrible, and you click. Generally, I like it. It's just a bit weird. But I call it relactivism versus activism, right? How do we become activists? How do we stay engaged? How do we get motivated? Because often with these things, you know, we are disconnected from the source. And we see these things, and content comes in, and we are staying, I would say to some point, you know, we stay very unengaged because we're using digital tools to connect versus what's going on inside. So sometimes I say that what we really need to do is find more internal emotional intelligence than just a technological intelligence. We need to find more empathy. We need to find more true, open-hearted conversations. We also think we can do it better as humans. This is part of our problem. You know? This is actually, somebody came up with the square watermelon. I mean, it's kind of an ingenious idea because watermelons are really awkward to pack. But I find it, you know, a little bit bizarre. The banana, probably one of the greatest inventions when it comes to intelligent packaging. It tells you when it's not ready, underripe, when it's perfect to eat, and it tells you when it's overripe. And what we started to do was think we could do it better, so we started to wrap bananas singly inside, and then we reward the company for doing it because it's in biopackaging. And we say, congratulations, Del Monte, you're doing a great job by being green. And I'm like, the banana's perfect as it is. Leave it alone. The Ocean Dome. It's a great example. Again, I understand building domes to recreate nature. I know, like, you have the ski dome here. But that makes sense because, you know, of the location. The Ocean Dome, just like the real thing, it was built so you could go onto the observation and look at the real ocean. We're building it within feet of the real thing. And it actually went out of business. Surprising, because the best Ocean Dome is 500 meters away, right? But what I realized about this was why this is at the very crux of the argument or the thought for me as I travel around and think about is that we're just dealing with what I would call an outdated brain model when it comes to our ability to act. We are dealing with an outdated brain model, and what I mean by that is we're more afraid of camping in the woods from an evolutionary standpoint, we're more afraid of the dark than we are losing the woods. We're more afraid of being eaten by a shark, even though statistically we're more likely to be hit by cars and, choke on a peanut than get eaten by a shark. But yet, we're more afraid than we are losing the species. So we're more afraid of getting eaten than we are losing the species. We used to be hunter-gatherers, but now we gather too much. We've become much more efficient hunters. So our brain hasn't caught up. And at the heart of that fear, we start to see the sentiments. The fear is starting to be perpetuated. When you think about your relationship to nature, when we start to look at the fear, we start to see it on the news, a megastorm, hurricane. We start to see it come through in a way that it's going to eat me or hurt me. I mean, I turn on, I now love National Geographic, but I turn it on now and it's always Shark Week. I feel like it's Shark Week every year. Every time I turn on the TV net, it's like, look at this shark, it's about to come and eat someone. So we're afraid. Or look at this megastorm, or look at this hurricane. So we actually create this sense of detachment further because we're intimidated. And you start to see these conversations, extreme weather reports, predatory animals, tragedies in nature. These tend to make the headlines. So we have to start removing the fear. And to do that, I go back and say we have to start looking at nature. There is a resistance party out there, and it is nature. It's starting to come back. We have to replace our fear with curiosity. We have to let go of all our ideals, the way that we thought, the way that we think. We have to start really engaging with curiosity again, right? We have to really ultimately realize that nature is a magician. Who doesn't like nature? Right? I've never met anyone. There's a few people that hate mosquitoes. I don't like mosquitoes. Who likes mosquitoes? No one was asked. Yeah, good. We're all on the same page. But nature is a magician. It does the most incredible things when you really think about it, right? If we could change that fear with curiosity. And what I mean by that is we start to look at nature not as something that we can just consume or destroy or use for our own benefit, but something that we can learn from. When I look at this, for example, this is a bee that has figured out, right, how to be efficient in its pollination. Hyper efficient. And why do I say that? It's figured out what they call the traveling salesman problem, a problem that many people have spent tons of time trying to figure out. When a salesman goes from A to B, how does he maximize his fuel in relation to his selling pattern? A bee that has a brain the size of a grain has figured out this complex algorithm. So what could we learn from that? I noticed yesterday that there was conversations about the Dubai government moving to the blockchain, right? Information data, how information flows, how cars move through cities. If we could understand this algorithm that this humble bee has figured out on its own, with a brain the size of a grain, then maybe we could use that and apply it to how we consume data, how we consume products, how we move through cities. That becomes, I think, exciting. Not only that, they just found out recently that around flowers you see the blue ring. They just realized that this is a marker system for how bees land. Nature's figured that out. Blue is one of the hardest colors to replicate. And so the patterning on the surface has created this blue halo effect, so it picks up on the blue in the light spectrum. And there's an invisibility that the bees can only see this, and they come landing in. So nature's figured out a way to optimize its landing pad as well. Nature's figured these things out, yet we're losing insects now. We've lost, as they said recently, there was a report that came out, it's something like half of the insects since the 70s have disappeared, gone. Insects go, what feeds birds? Birds start to disappear. The chain effect goes on and on and on. Insects go, pollination goes. So we've got to look at them as these little magicians and start to learn and go, if we could actually revise the way we look at that, back to replacing fear with curiosity, the shark is a great example. We are afraid of the shark, but if I was to tell you that the shark has a unique patterning on its skin that makes it incredibly fast through the water, it has these ventricles, right? You see there in the bottom left-hand side. And the patterning of that allows for water to much more efficient over its skin. But more than that, when they studied the shark they realized that there was no bacteria building up in between. So somebody realized, a smart person, said, well, if we take that patterning and we apply it to surfaces, could we create a natural antibacterial protection? And the answer is yes. There's a company now that is putting it onto hospital doors, onto mobile phones, onto car handles, and is starting to take this patterning and apply it. Why is that important? Well, we're moving to a period of time where we're now down to our last 2 strains of antibiotics. 2 strains left. If you look at the World Health Organization's reports, you'll start to notice that we are, it's not if, but when we get into a post-antibiotic era. What does that mean? It means that we're all exposed. Common colds, surgeries, things that we take for granted because we can treat with antibiotics could cause, could end up in death now. So something like this, instead of looking at the shark as a predator that's going to eat me, I look at it as something that can help save us. I think that's exciting and dynamic. I think then you can start to find this innovation, this conversation, it keeps flowing. I also think that collaboration is one of the most important things. I think as humans, we've traditionally done great things when we work together. Back to this idea of spaceship Earth. This is the Dymaxion map, which was introduced by Buckminster Fuller. When you look in nature, there is no organism that exists in isolation. So I think if we can actually start to learn to find that common thread, that common connection, sharing data, sharing best practice, not being afraid to recognize that it's not a competition anymore, but rather it's a collaborative approach to our ability to live on this planet. We have to start sharing data. We have to start recognizing that there is no winners and losers. There's just losers if we don't start collaborating together. We all want to win because we all want to live on spaceship Earth. So if we can spend time together figuring out, we're much smarter. I always say, nobody's as smart as everybody. And I think if that is something that we could take away from this, that would be, I think, one of the most empowering things that anyone can do, is to go next door. Because I walk next door, and this is, and I'm overwhelmed by all the incredible, products in there. But there's probably 10 people doing the same thing. Sorry, everyone's probably like, no, don't say that. But imagine, you could say, why don't we all work together and figure out your shared technology? I get it, it's a race. But when we're looking at things that can actually give us water and clean air and energy, those things that are actually in abundance, we should work together to help make that transition sooner. It shouldn't be a competition, but it should be a collaboration. And then finally, I think one of the things to get us moving is, again, back into the web of life, right? This idea that we are on top. Coming back to when I started out, when you look at a child and their relationship to nature, we all were children at one point, and when we looked at nature, I'm still a child as well. That was another thing Albert Einstein said. He said you can grow old but remain immature indefinitely. But when you look out and you see that look in the face of a child initially, right, you start to recognize that innate nature, that connection, that curiosity. We all have that because children place themselves in the middle. We are part of the web of life. We have one opportunity to live on this planet. We have all the solutions today. I know that everybody is saying, well, what's going to happen? We have to plan for 2025 or 2050. We need to start working today together with more curiosity, with more empathy for each other, for more integration of ideas. Because we can solve it. We have to work with nature as our partner, not just as something that we can consume. We have a great opportunity to do it. And I know that when there's forums like this, it's super inspiring to be able to share my stories. So thank you very much for allowing me to share my story. I appreciate it.
Our thanks to Mr. Rothschild for his wonderful speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a 20-minute break. After that, we'll return and continue our remaining sessions. Please know that we have privileged ministers joining us in the upcoming sessions, and so we do not want to miss what they have to say in their sessions. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we will reunite once more in 20 minutes. Thank you.